Can you talk a little bit more about what distraction is? You mentioned the missing out part.
Yeah.
What is distraction, and how does that pop up?
Well, maybe it's helpful to think about it this way, that often when we are multitasking with our smartphones in one of these in-person situations, like at dinner with family and friends, or at a concert or in a college classroom, we think that we're actually doing two things at the same time. But actually what we're doing
I can already see where this is
switching.
going. Yeah, sorry.
I know. So we think we're doing two things at the same time, but actually we're switching back and forth between two activities, texting with a friend on the one hand, and on the other hand, following a conversation at dinner. And sometimes these two different tasks are somewhat complementary, and sometimes they're very uncomplimentary. And what's interesting about it is that, and before I forget, I'm going to mention some philosophers right now who I owe a debt to in this area, which is the philosopher Diane Michelfelder, Robert Rosenberger, and the sociologist Jane Vincent, who some of the things I'm going to talk about touch on some of their work. Here's what's interesting about this multitasking, which is actually task switching, is that when you are texting with a friend on your smartphone, there's a perceptual structure that goes along with that. And that perceptual structure involves, in the simplest way, the content that your friend is texting is in the foreground, and in the background are your, environmental conditions. I mean, if you're at a lecture and you're texting with a friend, in the foreground is the friend and what you and the friend are talking about. In the background is, whispers behind you, the lecturer talking, the heads moving in front of you of people sitting in front of you. That stuff's all in the background. And in the foreground is your texting and the friend that you're texting with. Now, that kind of perceptual structure often goes unnoticed. We don't realize that we're actually shifting back and forth between two very different perceptual structures. And what's even worse is that we text so often in so many different situations that we rehearse that perceptual structure that's particular to the phone so many times of the day in so many different places that it's very ingrained. It's difficult to control. It's kind of sticky. And so switching back between these two perceptual structures where the phone structure is so ingrained, we don't notice we're doing this. And what often happens is that we lose time. We don't do it as quickly as we think we do it. So sometimes you notice if you're around somebody who's using their smartphone, sometimes you'll notice that they lose a couple of seconds, or sometimes they're gone for a little bit longer than they thought they were. And so this is the explanation for that. So the big point is about this perceptual structure business and the stickiness of it is that this task switching that we're doing in these situations is slower than we think it is. It drags because of these ingrained perceptual structures. And so that creates the conditions for distraction, because if you're somewhere like a lecture or a dinner or a concert, and there's something in person that you are trying to pay attention to, when you start task switching, you're dealing with these alternate, inverted, in some cases, perceptual structures. And it's just quite difficult to keep both things going at the same time. And sometimes, we'll talk about later that sometimes even just the fact of checking out sometimes to check into your smartphone destroys a kind of evolving, developing experience of the main situation. But so that's sort of the way that I set up thinking about distraction with a smartphone is that there's this moving back and forth, and that just necessarily results in a kind of distraction.
So let me just make sure I'm on the right track. I think I understand what you're talking about. So distraction, one way to define it would be unnoticed temporal or unnoticed time loss or temporal loss because of perceptual structure switching.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's interesting to think about is that it's sort of the way that you define distraction, the way that you define what's problematic about certain kinds of distraction depends upon what you're distracted from. Different kinds of situations require different kinds of engagement, and meaningful activities require a dedicated, close kind of engagement. And so being pulled away on your phone, even just for a short time, can have a devastating effect on keeping up with a meaningful activity that you're engaged with.